Folks, welcome inside the Parisi Palace, high above 3733 East Broadway. This is a special live edition of the Jake Feinberg Show, coming to you live on Power Talk. Please go to our website, powertalk.live, download our free app, and stream all of our live local programming, including Solomon on Blast, the Jim Parisi Show, and yours truly, the Jake Feinberg Show. And we can't thank you enough for making us part of your day today, so we can continue to elongate the lineage of music with cats that have been on this earth a lot longer than myself, and one of the most decorated percussionists and rhythmists that has ever graced this planet is my guest now, friend of the program, a guy I did a great interview with about 5 years ago, Warren Smith. Welcome back to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Well, thank you, Jake. It's my pleasure to be here.
You know, I wanted to ask you, Warren, on the trap set, if you could talk about a time live that you played in a double drums context.
Oh, wow. I can't remember all of them.
Whatever comes. Yeah, whatever comes into whatever comes.
Yeah, just this past, a few months ago, I was in Denmark, and it was a music conference hosted by Christian Norwood, who is also a percussionist from Denmark, and also we had Louis Maholo from South Africa there, and I did do drum duets with the two of them on that program.
I guess more specifically, can you talk about back in the day? I mean, I'm looking at Joe Cocker, Mad Dogs and Englishmen, the Allman Brothers, the Grateful Dead. But then obviously you look at a lot of jazz albums that were cut. I've talked to just a bunch of cats that had double drums, and I wanted you to talk about why, especially in the context of rhythm, the rhythms of diaspora, why a double drum setup was so prevalent at that time. Obviously, they were white bands playing rock music or whatever, but I'm talking about more the aesthetic of, the African-American art form known as jazz.
Yeah. Are you talking about double bass drums or just two drummers?
Talking about two trap sets.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. That was kind of unusual, pretty much. I know I didn't get introduced by the concept, but Max Roach is quite prevalent in my memories for doing things like that. Because we had this group Ohm Boom, and we invariably used two drum sets within that percussion ensemble.
What was the role?
And
so what, I mean, and if how would you delineate what the roles of those trap sets of the roles of each of those drummers?
Well, it was sometimes it was a matter of just needing more power. Sometimes I remember doing things like that with larger ensembles where a whole orchestra of musicians would be spread out, and you might have a drum set on either side played by different people. That seemed to be pretty popular, I guess in the 70s and the 80s. A lot of the larger bands were starting, and in fact, Broadway shows during that time were starting to use two drummers also, but one of them was primarily a percussionist.
So can you talk about a specific example? Because what I'm getting at is that, these are things that you don't see in a live music context anymore. You don't see, Don Ellis had three drummers on stage with him. So I'm just trying
Yeah, that was a good example.
So,
yes.
Can you talk about a time when you were in that context and what your role was if you weren't the primary timekeeper?
Well, if my role was, I'm trying to recall a specific instance which isn't coming to mind right away, but I would say that my role, from a personal standpoint, not from discussing it with the other drummer, would have been to exploit what that drummer was doing improvisationally by playing time or helping the rest of the ensemble to interpret what that drummer might have been doing. In other words, it would have been to emphasize the overall propulsion of an orchestra, where perhaps one drummer might not have been a strong enough force.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, it would be great to put it in a specific context, just because I'm just trying to get at the idea that I don't need to tell you this, but the music that you came up on and cut your teeth on was dance music, and that having multiple drummers, and being able to stay out of each other's way is, to me, I mean, just what I'm getting at is that, I since I've talked to you, I've probably done about 700 other interviews, and Reggie Workman, for instance, he said to me that he could go see a 45-minute set of jazz, and it would be a burning set, and it's great, and it's tight, and it's polished, and the drummer doesn't touch the cymbals. Joe Sample says, rest in peace, he said drummers could be in their 50s, and they don't know how to use the cymbals. They don't touch the cymbals. And so what I'm getting at is not just colors, but the fact that cats like Roach and Kenny Clark and just a whole host of people, they were using the cymbals as they were dancing on them, and they were also keeping time. And I kind of wanted you to talk about, when you got behind the trap set, how you used the cymbals to keep time, and how you used the bass drum as an accent rather than the primary timekeeper, if you did that. Because nowadays all you hear is double bass drums pulsating, and that's the primary timekeeper. That was not the case in the 40s and 50s, and I'd like you to take us through your evolution behind the trap set.
Well, now you mentioned the bass drum, and I found both through experience and through some helpful hints from some of my elder peers that the bass drum affects the sound of the cymbals as well as the bass violin. It's the bass drum is very important because it's a sound that is not obvious to most people when they're listening to an orchestra. But the pulse of the bass drum accentuates the rhythm of the cymbal, because the cymbal spreads very, very greatly. It just if you hit a cymbal, you can come back 10 minutes later and the cymbal is still vibrating.
Right.
See, so that doesn't necessarily encourage or help the definition of the rhythm itself, but the playing of a bass drum with a cymbal enhances both the sound qualities of the cymbal and emphasizes the beat upon which you play the cymbal.
Can you personalize it as to when you were in a jazz context, when you got behind the trap set? How did you use, how did you use the drum, the trap set, to keep time? Were you using the bass drum as the primary timekeeper, or were you?
The bass drum is usually, in my context and the way I use it, the bass drum is definitely the timekeeper. Now, it's not something that I've listened to and played in bands where the bass drum, for instance, like a Buddy Rich bass drum, was very obvious.
Right.
And it was always there, and he built his band around. Incidentally, Buddy Rich used two drummers in his band.
Really?
Yes, he was often playing, but there was another drummer that was there to enhance the functionality of the beat if he would go off and do some kind of soloistic thing.
It's fascinating.
I had a couple of friends who actually worked with Buddy Rich. Phil Brown, for instance, was the regular drummer in Buddy Rich's band. See, now Buddy, what a lot of people don't realize, was also a tap dancer and a singer. And he grew up as a child performer doing that. And so he often would get off the drums and do other things. Somebody like myself, who was always involved with percussion as well as the drums, would use another drummer to give myself the ability to play mallet instruments or timpani or some other percussion enhancement of an orchestra.
This is interesting. Like Phil Brown, I mean, he was keeping time, and Buddy was just basically doing polyrhythmic or soloing. He was not actually playing time during his gigs when he had a second drummer.
Well, Buddy Rich, you couldn't say that because his whole concept was based around time and rhythm. You know, he was not of the group of avant-garde percussionists who ventured off of that. So that never varied from him. But there were times when he might need the pulsation there if he got up in front of the band, which was generally the case because he was the band leader most of the time that he played.
So, I mean, can you talk about your, Warren? I have to ask you. I mean, I would love you to talk about your experience with the beat poets of the '50s. I ran into this album by a guy named Jack Hammer, who is a beat poet, and they didn't list who was on the gig, but it was a burning jazz band. Ferlinghetti used to go down into the basement in Berkeley, and he'd have a backup band. And I know you were playing gigs with poets. And can you talk about a poet, or in the '50s especially, the kind of mix of poetry and jazz that you were involved with? I've done 3 interviews with Wavy Gravy, who was known as Hugh Romney. He started that at Boston, at Boston University, but. I mean, and we've touched on the Melvin Van Peebles stuff, but I'm going back to the beat poets, and I want to know Warren Smith's activity with those cats, or in any sort of live improvisational theatrical setting.
Oh man, did you ever hear of the Last Poets?
Oh, I've interviewed Abidon Olewole, yeah.
Yeah, because they were. Yeah. They used to come up to my studio and rehearse and do things, and there was always room, I thought, in poetry for percussion enhancement. I've listened to a lot of poetry, and coming up in the Midwest, that was a big thing before I came to New York even, but it was more intensified when I came to the East Coast because there was a lot more experimentation, and there were whole groups of people. Melvin was not actually even the first one. He got his ideas from somewhere else. But I worked with Melvin Van Peebles on his first couple of albums. In fact, on 3 albums that he did as a singer, poet, whatever, And I was left to my own devices as to how to back up that kind of thing. There was a studio in Manhattan that was run by a man named Richard Alderson, who is fortunately still around and with us and still producing things. But we worked with a variety of different composers and poets and wordsmiths, however you wanted to call them. The whole poetry thing was evolving, and it was constantly incorporating more and more music. So these were things that I was really involved in the 60s, 70s, and the 80s.
Well, I'd like you to be a little more specific. I mean, you're speaking in generalities, but when you moved to New York, there were cats that were at the forefront. The beat poetry scene was at the forefront, as was bebop. Can you talk about?
Yes, that's right.
So can you just talk about how you fit into that? Who you played with? Did you cross paths with these guys, Ginsberg and Kerouac and because those cats were in many ways, and also did you go down to the Gaslight Theater and perform down there or down in that Village area?
I was in the Village all the time playing with different people.
Who?
Let's see. I'm trying to think of some of the people that came more familiar during those days. There were places that we would go to. There was a place called the Fat Black Pussycat.
Shit. think we lost Warren Smith here. We're going to rejoin the Jim Parisi show.
Light aircraft flights for the purposes of trafficking. So back to the point then of this wall.
Hello?
So funny. I mean, literally, you just said black fat pussycat, and we got disconnected. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
But this was a place where a lot of the people who were emerging as prominent wordsmiths were around. For instance, Bill Cosby was working at a basement club in the village across the street from us, and he would come over during our break and work on his whole system of doing things. You know, we never actually played with him directly, but there were other poets around. I'm having a hard time calling up some of the names, but Cosby was one of those people that was involved and was beginning to consider music. I was working with Tony Williams. Tony Williams had started a small band with 3 percussionists, Don Elias and himself and me. And Cosby came in one day on our break and asked Tony if he would be interested in doing a television show with him. All right. Tony said, "Oh man, I ain't interested in that shit. I'm a musician. I wouldn't be." And a couple of us in the band were, "Hey, Tony, that's Cosby, man. He's and Tony couldn't see it, so Cosby went and got himself another bunch of musicians to work with.
Wow. Okay, I want to be clear. This is so awesome. So, and this is before Cosby became Cosby. He wasn't really famous at this point.
Well, he hadn't. He had been on the. He was on the cusp of getting his own show. He had been on the Ed Sullivan and a couple of other shows, and had been a great hit that they were calling him back. And the network was offering him this chance, but Tony Williams was such a purist as a musician, and you have to realize Tony was pretty young. He was probably still in his 20s. He couldn't see the connection that would have given him, to expose his music as well. And that was before jazz musicians were really getting into the, into the concert, or not into the concert, but into the television market, like the Marcellus brothers.
Sure. Well, I guess because Cosby. I did 2 interviews with him, and he had that show where he was a gym coach, and he used to bring on Jimmy Smith and Groove Holmes. But this, But I mean, when he came in and offered you, so there was 2 separate times. There was the time at the Black Fat Pussycat where he would come in because he was working at the Gaslight, right?
Yeah, he was working right across the street. Right. The
So
Gaslight was one of the places.
Right.
Jimi Hendrix was in there and out of there all the time.
Hendrix was in the Gaslight?
Yeah. There were a couple of clubs right on McDougal Street. We were all these clubs were concentrated on McDougal Street.
Cafe Wah.
And Cafe Wah was the place that Jimi Hendrix was at. You're
exactly.
Right. You're right. I get these things.
It's all right. But this is what I've been woodshedding about for 6 years. But the thing is,
well, good.
Yeah. No, but I dig is but when he came in that first time just to work on his improv, then later on, when you and Elias and Tony were together, this was later, or was it around the same time that he offered you this opportunity?
Oh, it was a couple of years after.
Mm-hmm.
He had begun to create some some power on his own right, because it was on the cusp of his getting his own television show. And some of us could see this, but a lot of musicians still couldn't see the connection between the larger entertainment picture, and especially a lot of jazz musicians. I mean, I was pretty much a jazz purist myself, but I began to see these things because I was, maybe 10 years older than most of the people I was working with. I had been doing commercial television show. I was on staff at ABC, Channel 7 in the 60s, and just doing recording almost every day, doing rock and roll records with the Detroit people that would come in before they had, started the whole Motown thing.
Wow, at the Brill Building?
I wasn't. I did things at the Brill Building, but this stuff was evolving downtown more so than in Midtown.
You're talking about, did you work with like George Clinton before the Motowns? I mean, I'm just really, this is so unbelievable because
George Clinton was not one that I worked with, but there were a whole bunch of other people that there were some pretty iconic groups like the Pearls Before Swine and
oh yeah.
I'm trying to think of some of those other rock groups that were branching off into more poetry and more exotic backgrounds and things like that. And I was doing a lot of experimental stuff with them also. I never turned down a damn thing. If somebody wanted me to come and play some country music, sure. You need somebody to slap a tambourine with a gospel, yeah, I'll do that. And it just gave me all kinds of other opportunities, as well as connections with people that could see that I could do some things that they hadn't thought of yet.
Could you talk? This is so fascinating because a lot of cats. You're not the first one to say that you were kind of a jazz purist, snob, so to speak. Was there? Could you talk about you just talked about this crossover of music, the Duke Ellington School. It's all music, and actually, John B. Williams, the bass player, told me a couple weeks ago that he thinks that Duke's been misquoted. That in fact, it's all music. It's not either good or bad because that's subjective. And that's an opinion thing. So really, he thought that Duke just said it was all music. Was there a point? Could you point to a time when I know you took every gig you got, but I mean when you started to veer off of the purity of jazz and realized that you just were into playing music?
Well, what happened was when I came to New York, I was hanging out at all the clubs and stumbling in and out of that because I wasn't the player that I am now. I didn't know nearly as much, and I hadn't learned as much as I needed to learn to be somebody who would be working steady. But I was in the Manhattan School of Music. I met a gentleman named Kovich Taylor Perkinson, who had just graduated from the school. But he was a terrific composer and arranger, and he was working with a whole bunch of other people. He took me to the record date that Max Roach had done with Abbey Lincoln and I think Sonny Rollins, because he was writing some arrangements for that.
Sure.
And then another friend of mine who was a former schoolmate was working in the West Side Story, in the original show. And he needed a sub, and the show was getting ready to go on the road, so I came in to sub for him as a percussionist and then went on the road for 18 months with the West Side Story as the drummer. Now, that, helped me to be a better drummer, but it also gave me an insight into a whole genre of other music, which was Broadway show music. That was the first Broadway show I ever did. I wound up doing about 40 or 50 Broadway productions as a result of that.
Yeah, Kat, that I'm producing a documentary on Stan Getz, movie documentary, and one of the cats that I went to visit back in the fall of last year was Seymour Red Press. Did Seymour Press help you? I brought up your name, and he
Red was in that first band that I did with the West Side Story.
Can you talk about that? About his because that dude could play, man. He
could play. He definitely could play, but he got caught up in that show business and became a contractor.
Exactly.
And that kind of, I think, got in the way of his ever being able to play music that he wanted to play anymore, because actually the opportunity to make that money was a once in a lifetime chance for him, as both a contractor and a participant so he just started contracting shows. I never heard Red play. I heard him play in a couple of bands that showed that he was a legitimate, jazz improvising musician. But the money was so important that he never got back to that.
Yeah, he gigged a little bit with. I mean, he was more of a swing player. He didn't love. I mean, I think he admired and respected the bebop players, but he. I brought up your name when I went to visit him, and he nodded his head. He's 90, still sharp as all get out, and he did hire you.
Yes.
He hired you for a lot. Going back to the
Yes, he did. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
But going back to the Pussycat, who were you get? What not with Cosby, but what was that general band that you were playing with? Was it like? I mean,
It was a pianist named Ellen Starr, and it was she and I.
Yes.
I think the bass player was Herb Bushler,
Sure.
who's been around a long time.
I've talked to her.
And yeah, and Jeremy Steig was the lead player. He was the flutist, of course.
My,
you know.
what year? This is unbelievable, Warren. Are you kidding me?
Oh man, this was. Oh, let's see. This had to be in the early '60s.
So it was basically you were playing standards. Were you playing original tunes? I mean, can you talk about?
We were doing a little bebop. You know, we weren't all completely developed. The pianist was a little bit behind us, but it was more or less her gig. So, you know, Jeremy hadn't even at that time done any recording in his own name.
Sure.
You know, we were all. I was still in my middle or late 20s at that time, and it was just a great place to be there. Like I said, Hendrix hadn't broken out yet, but he was there on the scene all the time. You know, and you know, all these guys were still young and you know, doing their best experimental stuff. I'm trying to think of the name of that group with Ed Saunders and Tuli Kupferberg.
You're really digging in deep now. No, listen, here's the thing. But none of the, I mean, this was still unamplified acoustic music. Is that right?
Yeah. The bass players were just beginning to start using electrified amplifiers.
Exactly.
You know, and even the Fender bass was still making its way onto the scene. That was mostly for rock and roll recordings. And you didn't see nearly as many electrified instruments. Well, of course, the whole technology has taken off now, you know. So, but yeah, this was largely an acoustic, you know, an environment.
Could you talk to the audience about the idea of if it made it harder to swing when you had a bass player all of a sudden that had an amplifier at the bottom of their upright bass, and especially with the Fender Rhodes as well. I was talking to Mike Clark, the drummer, and he was talking about playing with Bobby Hutcherson and Woody Shaw at the Both And in San Francisco. And and he just said one night, he goes, "Man, this is really, it just feels rough. The time it doesn't feel smooth. It's not swinging." And he looked down at James Leary's upright bass, and there was an amplifier at the bottom of it. And then also he said it changed when the Fender Rhodes came in. I kind of wanted to get your opinion on that, how it changed the swing element to the music.
I don't think it really changed the swing element at all. What it did was make everybody adjust their own listening apparatus. You know, we were used to playing so that you could hear the unamplified bass, you know, and we found out that if you play the bass drum and the bass in synchronization, that the rhythmic impulse of the bass was enhanced by the bass drum. You see, now there were a lot of drummers that didn't know that and that relied for their time keeping on the cymbals, but the cymbals they rang too much to really define time, so you had to have bass and snare drums to enhance the beat, you know, to pinpoint the beat so that everybody else could hear it, you know. But we could, you know, we could see that just with the bass and the drums, you'd be in a dance hall with a crowd full of people, and as long as the bass and the drums kept playing, the people would keep dancing. They could hear it perfectly well.
Wow, you just dropped some. Okay, so this is interesting. So so you said the drummers were used to keeping time on the cymbals, but the long the ringing of it made it so that it was not after a while, the bass drum became a logical timekeeper because it didn't have the sustain that the cymbals did. Am I reading that? Is that right?
Yes, you are. Yes, you are. And people that are in that environment all the time learn to listen for those, lower definitions of the beat as the pulse, rather than hearing the things that are on the top. Like a snare drum and a cymbal ting can come across, but even cymbals in those days were not as specialized as they are now. You have certain cymbals on the drum set that you can distinctively play time, and then other cymbals, the time kind of washes away because the cymbal has a tendency to roar and expand and disguise the pulse.
Talking to Warren Smith here on the Jake Feinberg Show, live on Power Talk, having a ball here. Because when I did my second interview with Tootie Heath a couple weeks ago, and he said that Donald Duck Bailey he became a master wood shop guy, and he actually built a drum set with ashtrays and rivets in the cymbals. This is before they actually made cymbals with rivets.
Yes.
And I wanted you to talk about a modified trap, how you put together, one of the craziest modified trap sets that Warren Smith ever had. Because the point is that, Duck was doing it to fit his, where he felt comfortable. Tootie said you never wanted to follow him after a jam session because the snare drum would be off to the left or the right, and it would just make it real. So can you talk about some of the, all I'm trying to get at is this, is that my generation at 39, younger generations, we have much more limited opportunities to actually play live. So there's a lot of less opportunity to.
Oh, wow. That's something.
Well, and so you can't experiment as much. You can't develop your own individual sound. And you feel like a need to conform in order to pay to play or play for the door, whatever it is. And, and I sort of am just kind of wanted to throw that all out the window and talk about some of the inventiveness that, you guys just were inventors of rhythm and sound, and I wanted you to talk a little bit about your own ingenuity when it came to that stuff.
Well, one thing I remember very distinctly, I used to watch Max Roach do something on the hi-hat that he had learned from Papa Joe Jones, Jonathan David Jones,
yes,
who was the old Count Basie band. He really set the style for the big band swing drummers, or at least for the contemporary evolution of that. And I was watching Max do this thing where he played up and down with one hand while he was articulating with the other hand on the closed hi-hat. And he would manipulate the pedals so that you'd get the open and closed sound, but it sounded like 2 or 3 people were playing on the hi-hat,
Wow.
Now, another friend of mine, oh man, why can't I think of this man's name? He's another percussionist. He does a lot of inventing. I was figuring out how to do something like this on a solo performance that I did, and he built me 3 sets of hi-hat cymbals that had been welded together so that if you hit the pile of them, you get like a crash like you would get on a half-close hi. But there were 3 different ones that I could fit on the same stand. And I used this as a tribute to Joe Jones and Max Roach and did a whole solo piece just with that instrument. That was one of the adaptations that I made. I still have those instruments there. I might resurrect that sometime within the next year.
Yeah, no, we don't. Is this cat still alive, this builder, or you don't know who he?
Oh yes. I the name is now escaping me. He's a percussionist who does a lot of the downtown avant-garde music. He's going to call me up and kill me if he heard this for not remembering his name.
He will kill you. All right, listen. Let's put in a piece of music here, and then you can think about it. All right, we'll come back and talk.
Yes. Okay.
Well, I want to apologize first off because you're way low in the mix on that. Unfortunately, you were playing beautiful percussion, but do you have any idea what that is from?
Oh man, that flute sounds so familiar when it first started, and then I kind of lost it. I didn't hear much of it
Yeah,
because yeah.
that was from an album from the attic of my mind, Sam Most.
Oh my God,
Yeah.
Sam Most, isn't that something?
When did you
Yeah.
first? When did you first stumble across Abe and Sam Most?
Oh man, that was very early after I got here because there weren't too many people playing jazz flute. Jeremy Steig was I had worked with him earlier, but these guys were much more advanced. Sam in particular, Herbie Mann was playing flute. He was very prominent in those days. And oh wow, isn't that something? I had completely forgotten about that whole session.
Yeah, we got
Yeah.
It's an amazing album. It's Walter Bolden, George Mraz, Kenny Barron, Warren Smith, Sam Most. That tune was called "Child of the Forest," and you're playing.
Yeah, I remember that one recording that I did with Sam. Yeah.
I mean, can you talk about when I interviewed Airto, he talked about bringing a kashiki and
Yeah.
all these. Did you have access to Brazilian percussion before Airto? Did you actually can you talk about when you met him and what he, because some of the stuff, the cuica, some of that stuff, it seems like I heard you used a lot of that kind of percussion on this album, and I'm just curious.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
Go
those
ahead.
things were kind of new to me. See, I had the advantage of I went to Manhattan School of Music and got a master's degree in percussion after spending 5 years at the University of Illinois because I was switching majors. I went from, believe it or not, architecture to music education to applied music, and then finally I got a degree in music education so that I could teach. But all this time now, I was working with people like in school. I had a chance to work with John Cage a lot. Harry Parch came and spent a year in residency, and I did his music. And I was doing, of course, in the university, I was constantly involved in orchestras and concert bands, playing percussion and other instruments. So when I came here, I had the reputation of being able to read music, first of all, and then being able to play percussion. So most of my performance in those first few years was as a percussionist rather than as a drummer. And, at the same time, when I started doing recordings, they started adding multiple percussion things. These things, I remember meeting Airto and Flora. I'm not sure they were even married then, but I met both of them individually, and then they got married, and she had some problems. There's all this hysteria about certain kinds of drugs, and the danger that they provide to society and all that shit that got us, people spent time in jail with that, But
yeah, I think they got. I think that there was some problems with when they were in that original incarnation of Return to Forever. I know that.
Yeah. That's when it came down on her. But I had worked with Flora off and on, and I had not heard very much Brazilian music. Actually, I hadn't paid any attention to it before I met Ayrton. But we were doing a lot of stuff, and he probably exposed me to some of those instruments. I didn't get to Brazil until very late in my life, like the last 10 years or so. But those instruments were coming, and I was doing a lot of commercial recording. I was on staff at ABC, Channel 7, and I was actually doing a country western show, the Jimmy Dean Show. But there were a lot of other spin-offs. If they did a big band show, the 20s or the 30s or the 40s, I was one of the few, I was the only percussionist who really played drums. And they had Don Lemon, but he was busy doing everything that he could done. So I got a lot of that spillover work in the studios. And, I put it to good use, is all I can say.
Can you talk about your impressions or looking back on Harry Partch's contribution, not just to music, but when he came to Illinois and how much it sort of expanded your consciousness and your ears?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. He came, that was my extra year because I was making up credits to get a degree after having switched majors so many times. And when he came, all the percussionists quit the orchestra and the marching band to join his ensemble. And there must have been about maybe 15 of us that, they had to really scuffle in the music department to people in marching bands because we were rehearsing with Harry 6 days a week or 6 nights, 5 nights, and then on Saturday after, when there were no classes. Just getting his music together. He had brought these instruments that he had made, for the most part, a whole bunch of different kinds of marimbas, and of course there was different kinds of notation. So we had to readjust our thinking to fit what he required us to do. There were meters that had one group of people playing in a 7 meter and another group playing in 5 meter. And we managed to just memorize how that rhythm went, as weird as it was. And to this day, I can use that, but he just made us think outside of the box. We had all been doing, even the, I don't like the term jazz, but even the so-called jazz music that I was doing was very straitjacketed. There were just certain things that nobody else was doing. And encountering people like Harry Partch and John Cage, who spent considerable time at the college doing projects with us, and different other outside-the-box composers influenced me to be a composer also. But it also gave me a whole bunch of possibilities of the use of percussion instruments. So I just I've made my whole career just being able to adjust to those kinds of things.
Could you talk about one of the things that that you were that allowed you to, that Harry sort of expanded your understanding of improvisation with? As you said, you were kind of straitjacketed, or you had a very certain strict belief system about melodic improvisation or jazz, and
yeah.
And what give me one example of something that sort of stretched you out.
Well, first of all, Harry's music had an octave that had like 66 tones in it. All right, so that meant that I mean there are scales that are more complicated than that, but this is approaching uh, the complexity of Indian music. Not commercial Indian music, but the Indian music that just isn't tuned by the piano. Our music is very, very simple, comparatively speaking. I mean, they had to uh, put marks on the fingerboards of the stringed instruments that he used in order to get those microtones.
Wow.
Because the string players are used to putting their fingers a certain way, and they had to edge up. Some of the wind players had to half cover some of the holes in their tone holes in their instruments to get those pitches that he wanted that were either flatter or sharper than what you might consider the tempered scale. And of course that blew all the strangeness of any harmony that people could write within the 12-tone system out of the water. These things, and he was using a different kind of we were used to playing in waltz time and 4/4, and the complexity of that was in the speed that some of the beboppers were playing. But nobody yet was playing in 7/4. Nobody had recorded in 5/4. Even Brubeck hadn't come up with Take 5 or any of that stuff yet.
Wow.
And as a matter of fact, Max Roach was experimenting with sevens during that time, but he had not recorded anything of that sort either. You had to go to hear it live and hear him doing things, and he would make an announcement that this experimentation was what he was going to do rather than straight ahead swing, so that people would understand and accept it. But so it had gone into improvisational music also, but Harry Partch's concept was just so, it was all he did from the time he was 15 years old, was make those instruments and develop that concept. So spending a year inside of that box with him really opened my mind up to all kinds of other contemporary music. And also, I would also like to add that as a percussionist, I was continually involved in playing contemporary music by just about all of the modern composers that are around today.
I mean, can you just be clear? You say Roach wasn't recording in 7, but he'd have to announce it to the crowd?
Yeah, he would tell them what he was going to do. I remember there was one piece, the first time I heard it, we were at the Blue Cornet in Brooklyn, which is a pretty famous jazz club that's no longer extant. But it was like a 3/4 blues, and Max was one of the first people to play jazz music in 3/4 time as well, jazz waltzes. And this one piece was a 3/4 blues waltz, and then one of the measures had a 5-beat meter in it, right in the middle. And it would get so that you would hear this elongated rhythm, and then it would go back to normal again. And everybody in the house would be looking for that to happen and would exclaim when it happened, I mean, the crowd just noticed it as something different, but it was an enhancement rather than something that spoiled the groove, if you understand what I'm saying.
No, I totally did, yeah. But I mean, you can definitively say that Partch was the first cat to record odd-metered jazz music, or odd-metered...
Well, it was all thoroughly composed music. There was no improvisation in Harry Partch. His music was all written out, through composed.
But but I mean, insofar as putting it on a record, though, was that that was the first time that music got put on vinyl, though?
I would say that would be close to being correct. I can't verify that entirely because those things had not met any sign of commercial exposure yet. There were all kinds of all these crazy composers that we hear now were those that were alive then. Some of them were even younger incoming composers, but they were not exposed to that kind of stuff until those things started happening. As far as the public is concerned.
Do you worry about? I remember Larry Willis talking to me about what Harlem used to be like. Sugar Ray Robinson had a barber shop up
Yep.
there, and there was,
and he had a jazz club.
He had a jazz club, and honestly, a lot of the culture was right out on the streets, and now you go to these places and they're gentrified, and a lot of the culture has been pushed off the streets into nightclubs. When I interviewed Merle Haggard, rest in peace, I mean, he in Redding, California, he said, if you're out at 10:30 at night, they'll haul, if you're running around in America at 10:30 at night, they'll haul your ass into jail. And and it's like
yeah.
and I mean, this is how what Larry told me. This is back in 2014, long before any of these recent elections or trends in the world. And
yes.
And he just said, we don't need another Hitler. But can you talk about how damaging it is when you stifle culture, and ultimately not even about younger peeps not knowing where they came from, but just for a society, when you stifle that culture, how dangerous it is for a free society?
I don't even know if it's possible to stifle a culture, because you can drive the culture into hidden circumstances. There was when I first came to New York, it was very infrequent. I came in 1957 to go to Manhattan School of Music. It was infrequent that you would see many white people hanging out in Harlem, and the ones that were hanging out were usually musicians that got off of Broadway shows and came up afterwards to hang out in the clubs. But there would be crowds of people in between sets out on the street on 7th Avenue, which is now, what is it, Malcolm X is what would be 6th Avenue.
There's a Miles Davis.
Lennox.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wait a minute. What is 7th Avenue? Adam Clayton Powell is 8th Avenue.
I don't know. I haven't been.
Yeah. Well. Anyway, my memory is terrible these days. But the people were out there, man, and the musicians who were interested in jazz were coming uptown late at night, and the clubs were staying open until 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the morning. And all the things that they tell us are dangerous, the drug culture and alcoholism and all that stuff, all those things were still happening, and they weren't any more dangerous then than they are now. I mean, there are health problems with those kinds of behaviors, but it wasn't such a thing that was looked upon, I mean, the police weren't over-policing us, as I think is happening now.
That's more to it's over-policing now. That's really what it's at.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
see, that over-policing is subjective to certain neighborhoods.
That's right.
The neighborhood that I live in Harlem now, you get a whole lot more parking tickets than you will in a white neighborhood. They just come and they're on you.
Well, even I mean, someone might wind up. I mean, Merle Haggard was arrested 12 times and spent a week in the hole at San Quentin, and he was still making hit records. I mean, how have we moved? How have we gotten to a more point to where crimes have become? We've become a more punitive society and a less a society that refuses to forgive. I mean, obviously, heinous crimes are heinous crimes, but what I'm talking about is I mean, Merle Haggard, his whole record was expunged by Governor Ronald Reagan. He was making hit records when he was in the hole. I mean, it's
I didn't realize that Ronald Reagan had expunged his record.
Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of peeps ran into, problems along the way, but yet they were not. I just look at it and I say we have people being put away unfairly, people being put away for mandatory minimums, and this, so when you have this over policing plus, in my mind, it's nice that you can that there are a couple of jazz clubs in New York City, but they're. I guess I just don't know. I'm looking for you to say, is this? Do you feel like every period of time is historical, or do you feel like this particular time that we're living through is particularly historical?
I think this time is particularly exceptional. Back in the 1920s, when I was first aware of it, a lot of musicians that had heroin problems were just moving to Europe. To France in particular, to Paris. A whole bunch of them moved there because the treatment of drug offenders was so inhumane in this country that they were just more comfortable there. People weren't arresting you for getting high or certain other behaviors that America just seemed to be really down on. And if you look back at it now, anybody who has traveled can tell you how different this society is in spite of its reputation for freedom and freedom of expression, and the fact that we have innovated all these different styles of music and art and literature. It's still much more punitive here than it is in other countries. And those other countries that they are criticizing all have universal health care. It's like in America, certain people are trying to punish those who deviate from what is expected to be genteel behavior, I guess.
I mean, and you nail it, and yet it's not anything totally new, but like, how did Max Roach... how did those cats navigate it? So, obviously they weren't breaking laws per se, but, it's like, to me, people like that, you look at modern day peeps today, they got targets on their back now. How were those leaders, Max, and those people that would go to blows over this stuff, members don't get weary, that kind of stuff, how did they avoid getting, because they weren't going along with this genteel Anglo, mentality? How did they navigate it? And are there lessons to be learned for today's revolutionary leaders that are basically trying to say, we're not, the world is, the sky is not fall. What's going on here in my mind is that there are these problems and issues that we have to fix. But when you inject extra fear, hyper fear plus economic anxiety, you're going to raise people to the point of hysteria and paranoia so that, they're going to shut down all common sense and logic. And now we're at a point where most of those people have tuned out common sense, facts, truth, and are believing what they want to believe. And I'm just wondering so are there lessons that that can be learned from when you guys were cultivating your sounds and experimentation, most importantly, your own cultural heritage, when you were a younger cat?
What we learned to do was to conceal our behaviors that were, how should we say, that were not considered standard. We go inside of our own population. I grew up in the 1940s in Chicago, and there was all hell raised outside of our window on the street. My brother and I didn't have a television. Television hadn't been invented. But that whole scenario that you see on television was playing itself out in real life on the streets outside, And that block that we grew up in, or that area that we grew up in, is now a pile of rubble and bricks. It was all commercial buildings and apartments. All that stuff has been knocked down. And I think at some point they're going to build up a high glass and steel structure for people who can afford extravagant rents. But these things have happened over and over again everywhere that I've been. Harlem has changed tremendously with this gentrification.
I know. And
You know?
you go to
But the
yeah.
gentrification can't hide the development of the arts.
How is that? Explain that to me, because I fundamentally don't agree. If you're bringing in people that are making, if you're making these places out to be boutique kind of things, then you're not going to have that visceral, raw ability to expand and to really just, go at something artistically. You're not going to be able to afford to live there.
Well, a lot of that is true. That's probably why more people don't go into these European environments and others that are more hospitable to the artists and the arts.
I mean, let me just put it this. Yeah, I mean, I went to San Francisco with my wife last year, and I think that's the other part of it. Warren, is like, explain, and not that you're a prophet, but you're a deep cat and you've been here a long time, and so we're walking by all these restaurants and Nob Hill and in San Francisco, and okay, so you go back to a time when Carlos Santana's band, Sly Stone, these bands, those cats, I've interviewed all those cats in those bands, Sons of Champlin, they grew up in San Francisco. That nest was cultivating and exploded. Obviously, there was a lot of people that immigrated out there from the East Coast in the Summer of Love, but even before that, it was indigenous America. It was peeps that grew up in the city. And that's where the music was cultivated from. Came out of the community. Now, you walk around late at night, or even like later in the evening, restaurants are packed and all this stuff, but yet it's mainly European, Middle Eastern, Indian. It's not indigenous. The point is, the people that live in the cities now are not native. Okay, the Chinese are buying all the property in New York City. So I mean, it's really hard.
These guys buying Trump's mansion.
Yeah, I mean, they're paying in cash, but I mean, it's so it's kind of like what when you have youth coming in and making an exorbitant amount of wealth early on, as opposed to allowing a community to grow and actually create music. To me, that's where the rubber meets the road. I don't know how you're supposed to have any kind of sophisticated culture, any consistent, display of that without it being. And it's impossible for it to be transcendent, because you want to have this sort of, very docile and very polite and rule following, kind of thing. And you have to be aware of this over policing, because all these people with money want to make sure that that there's no debauchery going on. To me, this is like a very to have somebody like this, like Trump, in control of the levers there. They're going after sanctuary cities. This is. I don't understand how we've become. Just doing this work on Stan Getz and going to visit Seymour Press. They both grew up in the East Bronx in the 1930s, and they were getting their ass kicked by the Irish and Italians every day, the Jewish peeps. But
man, Getz got busted all the time, for smoking reefer or some other thing, And that's why people like Kenny Clark moved to Paris. I was traveling with Boom with Max Roach, and on Kenny Clark's 70th birthday, Max was 60 and Art Blakey was 65, and I was sitting there at a table with them, listening to them talk as the fly on the wall, because I'm just learning. And these guys were Max was a little guy who was being made fun of and slapped up on the head, jokingly and whatnot, and he deferred to these two slightly elderly men who knew more than he did. But you could just see the quality and the level of their conversation and education was so far advanced that most people wouldn't understand what they were talking about.
What were they talking?
You know,
I mean, so I mean, this is also the Hot House, the move to France
yes.
in the 20s and 30s. Who like? Because I'm aware of those cats like Dexter and Johnny Griffin and Kenny Clark, and I thought that they kind of got out of here in the 60s, but you're saying it was happening 20s and 30s.
Oh, it was happening then. You know, my father lived in Paris or at least he lived in Europe and toured with Noble Sissel's band. You know, in the 20s, and then came back to Chicago, and you know, we were born, and my brother and I were born in the early 1930s. But there were people. Now I've got pictures and books that show histories of all this evolvement of a completely sophisticated urban life, and you know, the men were dressing up in tuxedos and going out and playing these gigs every night. You know, I saw my father put on his. I learned to tie a bow tie watching him. You know, and all this kind of stuff, and a lot of that, a lot of those refinements have been so negated that the younger black people don't understand what's happening now. And they've started their own action, which is going to someday catch on and be, you know, a development in society that with a power that it doesn't have, just because it's going to be there, and people invented it, you know.
I have. It's just so great to reconnect with you. I don't know. Billy Hart called you a mentor.
Oh my goodness!
Did you get a chance to play double drums with Billy, or can you talk about Billy, the impact? Because he
No, I remember going into a recording session one day, and Billy Hart, I can't remember who the other drummer was, were involved in this recording session, and he might be able to tell you who that other drummer was.
I bet it was.
But,
I think it was a Hal Galper album with Bill Goodwin.
I'm not sure it was Bill Goodwin,
okay.
And I know Bill pretty well too. But it was two drummers, and it came to the end of the piece, and they just made such a dramatically beautiful ending with these two drummers, which had never been done before, and everybody was looking at each other and say, "Damn, why did we, you know, we never thought of that before." And it was, you know, and Billy Hart was pretty young then. You know, he was maybe 30 or something. You know, but these things just happen because we've been exposed to a certain kind of culture that leads us to them.
Did you? I interviewed Barry Harris last Friday, and he pointed me in the direction of this Mel Powell album that had Diz, Prez, Bird, Mel Powell, no bass. Drummer played four on the floor, kept the bass drum going. Can you talk about a session that you played on that did not have a bass player?
I can't think of a recording session that I've played on that was of a jazz context that did not have a bass player.
But I mean, in general,
the only thing that would have replaced that would have been organs. You know, organs came into population, I guess, in the early '60s, and then that supplanted a lot of bass players. But no, I can't think of a session that I did that relied only on the drums.
What about organ trios? Can you talk about? I mean, because I know like Dick Hyman used to do double organs up in Harlem. Did you get involved with an organ trio playing traps?
Only a few rare times. I can't remember them, but one of the best recordings that I ever participated in was a Jimmy Smith album.
Which one?
With he had like a double saxophone section, and I think the drummer might have been Grady Tate. I think the drummer was Grady Tate, and I played timpani and percussion, and it was like two baritones, two altos, two tenors, and two sopranos. I know Jerome Richardson was involved in this state. It was called The Monster by Jimmy Smith. It was on that, what was that theme that he did on some movie or something, the monster theme or something. But that was the name of the album.
The Incredible Jimmy Smith. Yeah, look, I mean, this is the lineup: Richard Davis, George Dorsey.
Oh, okay. So Richard.
George Dorsey, Phil Woods, Grady Tate, Jerome Richardson, Kenny B, Jimmy Smith, Warren T. Smith Jr. on percussion.
That should have been I.
Yeah, it says T, and then you had Ray Beckenstein and Robert.
Ray Beckenstein
and Robert
Yep.
Ashton. Wow! And so you were burnt.
Bob Ashton.
I gotta get him a hold of that guy. And you're playing. Why did it make it such? Why was it such a burning session for you? I mean, again, also I'm talking about like Small's Paradise. Did you play live organ trio stuff? Just not on record, but I mean, just did you play in those contexts?
Yeah. No, I never had the chance to. You know, I'll tell you honestly, I was never probably considered a strong enough drummer to do that, you know, in terms of reputation, because a lot of people felt that because I was such a good reader that I probably couldn't swing, you know, and you know, a lot of those kinds of things kind of taint your career so that people are hesitant to call you as a drummer, you know, and a lot of very good percussionists would refuse to have their names listed as a percussionist in the union book for fear that people wouldn't call them to play the drums. And I suffered for this for a long time, and then I finally solved it by starting my own damn band, so I could play the drums, you know. So that was the way I solved it, you know. But reputations are very hard to break in New York City, you know. And I am not known as a drummer or even a good drummer in New York City. I'm just, you know. But now I'm beginning to break through with that a little bit because I have done a lot of recording and things.
Yeah, well, you're a Hall of Famer. I just wanted you to. My last question for you is: I went out to visit Big Black last summer.
Oh man!
And he said he rented a space back in the 50s called the African Bag, and Ray Bryant would play there for, I don't know, minimal money. And what is your recollection of Black as when he came on the scene as a conga player? Did you have a chance to collaborate with him at? I know he played with in the African Room with, I think, Johnny Barracuda. But I just wanted you to talk a little bit, and Richard Davis played bass on those. But what was your when? Do you remember did you have any collaborations with Black, and what was his significance to?
Yes, absolutely I do. What I remember about Big Black was that he had a big fat bass sound when he played those drums. You know, a lot of conga players, they're all on the top with the boom, you know, and all that kind of stuff. But Big Black used his tuba drum was very tall. It was maybe 4.5 feet high, you know, much bigger than other drums, and he was a big man anyway, as you probably know.
Oh yeah.
And he just had, you know, maybe it was the size of his hands and a lot of other stuff and the weight that he put on the heads, but you could tell Big Black because his sound had more bottom to it than most congas.
Do you remember
most conga drummers?
Did you get to see? I mean, did you remember when you saw him live? Like you said, do you remember what context? 'Cause he played with Dizzy for a while.
Yeah, I can't remember. We were in a couple of bands where he played congas and I played percussion or perhaps drums. You know.
Really? What bands were those?
I can't even remember, man. They were like pickup bands, you know, doing gigs, playing dances and things like that.
Wow, this
is
unbelievable.
And we were on several. You know, people were doing a lot of recording in those days. You know, a lot of people don't know it commercially, but this was when the Motown stuff was happening, and almost everybody felt like they had to come to New York to record. So people from Chicago and Detroit and all these places would come up, and we'd do a lot of these gigs, you know, bootleg recordings, they would call them, on Saturdays, because sometimes they were without union sanction or without union control, because they would pay us in cash, and a lot of the musicians probably weren't even in the musicians union. So, you know, it was, you know, it was a lot of work like that we did. You know, it was like, I hate to call it the black market of recording, but it probably
Well,
was.
no, it was like you would make these demos and then see if they made the cut, right? I mean, it was really
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, I mean,
Yeah.
I mean,
some of them did. You know.
but I mean, were the Funk Brothers coming in and you played with those cats like Benny Benjamin and James?
Yes.
Yeah, and James Jamerson.
Yes. Yes. All the time. You know. Yeah. Most of the recording studios worked from maybe Monday through Friday, and a lot of these sessions would take place on Saturdays. You know, the studios would be open, but they wouldn't be used by the commercial entities very much on the weekends. So a lot of the black music was recorded in those times and in those spaces, and a lot of the best of that music, you know, was being made in those times.
Warren, I'm going to get you a copy of this later on today. It's just always an honor to talk to you, man. And if there's if there's any way you can, do you know a cat named Freddie Red?
Oh man, what happened to Freddie Red?
I'm trying to figure out if he's still around. I'm just trying to get to these cats, you know. I mean,
I'm not sure if Freddie Red is still around. You know, I'm not positive, but I haven't seen or heard from him in years.
What about Billy?
But yeah, I used to go and see him play. You know.
Yeah, well, he did those incredible. What about Billy Taylor?
Billy Taylor's still around. He's much older now, but he's like a spokesman. He started the whole Jazzmobile conglomerate going, and well, Billy was an educator too. You know, he was teaching in colleges and doing a lot of other stuff. So, but he is still with us as far as I know.
Well, if you get a chance, I'd love to connect with Henry Grimes. I know you were going to pass that information along, but would love to do it.
I will. Henry and he is managed and micromanaged, I might say, by his wife.
Yeah, there's
Margaret
a few of those out there. Yeah.
Yeah. But Henry is around for for recordings and for interviews and things like that. So, but you would probably be in touch with Margaret Grimes to arrange it.
Right. Well, if you can, maybe if you have any contact info on her, you can give it to me later. Maybe it would be great. I just would like to.
Okay. Yeah. I can find it. I can give you a couple of phone numbers for contact.
All right. Well, let me get this.
I just don't have it right on.
I'm gonna be transcribing this and blowing it out on Facebook later, man. So. Much love to you, Warren. Keep it happening, man. It was such a great time to hang with you, man.
Well, thank you, Jake, and it's a pleasure to hear from you and to be noticed every now and then. So. Well, it'll thank you again.
It'll go on, man. It'll continue on. So much love. Take care.
Okay, thank you.
Cheers. Bye-bye.